Dinner plates clattered in the back kitchen, masking the quiet click of a safety disengaging. Ice melted in a lowball glass. A woman with tired eyes and bleach-burned hands slid a folded receipt across the mahogany table. It wasn't a bill. The ink was smudged, written in the frantic span of 30 seconds between refilling water glasses. 7 words that dismantled an empire. Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position. The steak grew cold. The trap snapped shut. Maeve's feet ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm that matched the bass line of the jazz track playing softly over the restaurant's hidden speakers. It was 9:40 p.m. on a Tuesday. The dinner rush at Il Rifugio had thinned, leaving only the stragglers, the romantics, and the people who conducted business strictly after the sun went down. She smelled of stale espresso, burnt sugar from the creme brulee torch, and the sharp chemical tang of the degreaser she'd used to clean a spill in the waiter station. Her uniform, a stiff black button-down and a bistro apron, felt like a second uncomfortable skin. Table 4 was her problem. Table 4 was always a problem, but tonight the atmosphere around it felt thick, viscous. Sitting there was Leo. She only knew him as Leo. He tipped in crisp $100 bills and drank his scotch neat, holding the glass by the rim so his fingerprints wouldn't smudge the crystal. He wore suits that didn't just fit, they looked sculpted onto his frame. But there was a heaviness to him. He carried the weary posture of a man who slept with one eye open, his shoulders eternally braced for an impact that hadn't quite arrived. Across from him sat Chloe. Chloe was a study in calculated perfection. Ash-blonde hair draped over a beige cashmere sweater. She smelled intensely of bergamot and expensive vanilla, a scent that clung to the heavy linen napkins long after she left. Usually, Chloe was animated, leaning over the table, touching Leo's wrist, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny. Tonight, Chloe was perfectly still. Maeve approached with a silver water pitcher. The condensation made the metal slick in her grip. As she poured, she let her eyes unfocus, a trick she used to observe a table without looking like she was staring. Chloe's hands were entirely out of sight, tucked beneath the tablecloth. Her shoulders were rigid. Every few seconds, her gaze flicked over Leo's shoulder toward the front entrance, then to the heavy velvet curtains blocking the street view. Her pulse was visible, a frantic fluttering in the hollow of her throat. "Is the branzino satisfactory, Mom?" Maeve asked, her voice a flat, practiced monotone. Chloe jumped, a sharp, ugly flinch that rattled her silverware. "Fine. It's fine." She didn't look at Maeve. She looked at her phone, which was resting on her lap. The blue glow illuminated the weave of the tablecloth from beneath. Leo looked up at Maeve. His eyes were dark, tired, ringed with the faint purple shadows of chronic insomnia. "We're good here, Maeve. Give us 20 minutes before dessert." "Of course, sir." Maeve turned and walked back toward the waiter station, the rubber soles of her shoes squeaking faintly on the hardwood. As she passed the corner booth, table 12, she paused under the pretense of adjusting a stack of polished spoons. Table 12 was occupied by 2 men who didn't belong in Il Rifugio. It wasn't their clothes. They wore dark blazers and collared shirts. It was their kinetic energy. They hadn't touched their bread basket. The butter was melting into a soft, yellow puddle. They had ordered black coffees 40 minutes ago and hadn't taken a sip. The man on the left had a thick neck and a pale scar cutting through his right eyebrow. The man on the right kept his right hand inside his coat, not resting on the lapel. Inside, deep in the breast pocket. Maeve wasn't a hero. She was a 31-year-old woman drowning in student debt, working a double shift to afford a root canal. She made it a point to mind her own business, but she knew the ecosystem of this room. She knew how people breathed when they were eating, how they shifted when they were bored, and how they went completely still when they were waiting for a signal. She looked back at table 4. Chloe was typing furiously under the table. The man at table 12 pulled his phone out an inch, glanced at the screen, and nudged his partner. A cold spike of adrenaline hit the back of Maeve's neck. It tasted like copper in the back of her throat. She walked into the waiter station, hidden behind a tall oak partition. The air here was warmer, smelling heavily of melting candle wax and damp dish rags. She grabbed a blank receipt from the thermal printer. Her hands were shaking. Not a violent tremor, just a subtle, high-frequency vibration that made her fingers feel numb. "Don't do this," her brain screamed. "Walk away. Go to the kitchen, take a smoke break." But she remembered the time a drunk patron had grabbed her wrist, hard enough to bruise. And Leo had simply looked at the man, leaned over, and whispered something that made the patron turn ash-white and leave the restaurant without a coat. Leo was a monster, probably. But he was a polite monster who paid her rent in tips. She pulled a ballpoint pen from her apron. It skipped on the slick thermal paper. She pressed harder, tearing the top layer slightly. "Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position." She folded the paper twice. It was a tiny, jagged square. She grabbed a dessert menu. Walking back onto the floor, the silence of the restaurant felt deafening. The clinking of forks sounded like shattering glass. She approached table 4 from Leo's blind spot. "Sorry to intrude," Maeve murmured, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the table. She slid the dessert menu next to Leo's water glass. Beneath the leather binding, she pressed the folded receipt directly against his knuckles. His hand twitched. He didn't look down. His thumb slid over the paper, recognizing the texture, the deliberate placement. "Thank you, Maeve," Leo said. His voice was smooth, undisturbed. Maeve didn't look at Chloe. She turned on her heel and walked directly toward the kitchen doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a violent, desperate rhythm. She pushed through the swinging doors into the blinding fluorescent lights of the back of house, praying she hadn't just signed her own death warrant. The receipt paper was rough against the pad of Leo's thumb. He didn't open it immediately. He kept his hands on the table, resting casually on either side of his plate. He chewed a piece of steak. It tasted like ash and salt. He forced himself to swallow, the meat heavy and dry in his throat. "Breathe," he told himself. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Decades in the life had trained him for violence. But the paranoia was a different beast entirely. It was a slow, creeping rot. It was the reason he couldn't sleep, the reason he checked the undercarriage of his car every morning, the reason he sat facing the door. "Are you even listening to me?" Chloe asked. Her voice was thin, strained. Leo focused on her face, really looked at her. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing the hazel of her irises. Her jaw was clamped tight, the muscles jumping beneath her skin. She had a habit of biting the inside of her cheek when she lied. She was doing it now. "I'm listening," Leo said, keeping his tone perfectly level. "You were talking about the villa in Tuscany, for August." "Right," she said, her laugh sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. "I just think we need a break. From the city, from everything." "A break sounds nice," he agreed. He slid his left hand off the table, taking the small square of paper with it. Under the cover of the heavy tablecloth, resting on his thigh, he used his thumb and forefinger to unfold the receipt. He glanced down a fraction of a second, just a flick of the eyes. "Your girlfriend sold you out. They're in position." The words didn't register as a shock. They registered as a confirmation of a cancer he already knew he had. A cold, heavy stone settled in his stomach. The air in the restaurant suddenly felt thin, pumped devoid of oxygen. He looked at Chloe, the woman he had shared a bed with for 3 years, the woman who knew the code to his safe, the names of his shell companies, and the fact that he took his coffee with a dash of cinnamon. He had bought her the diamond currently sitting on her right hand. He had paid off her brother's gambling debts, and now she was waiting for a bullet to tear through his skull so she wouldn't get blood on her cashmere. A profound, exhausted sadness washed over him, quickly replaced by a sharp, acidic wave of survival instinct. He didn't feel anger yet. Anger was a luxury for men who weren't currently sitting in a crosshair. Leo casually reached for his wine glass. As he brought it to his lips, he let his gaze drift over the rim. He didn't turn his head. He used the reflection in the dark, mirrored glass of the wine cellar to his left. Table 12. 2 men, late 30s, unshaven but not unkempt. The one on the right had his hand buried in his coat. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at Chloe, waiting for her to move, waiting for her to clear the blast radius. Leo set the glass down. The base clicked against the mahogany. "Excuse me for a moment," he said softly. Chloe blinked, her panic spiking visibly. "Where are you going?" "Restroom." "Wait," she said, her voice rising an octave. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers wrapping around his wrist. Her grip was damp with sweat. "Don't go yet. Finish your wine. Stay with me." She needed him in the seat. If he moved, he ruined the angle. Leo looked down at her hand on his wrist. Then he looked up into her eyes. He saw the exact moment she realized he knew. The facade cracked. The fake warmth drained from her face, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell. "Let go of my arm, Chloe," he said. His voice was no louder than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. She snatched her hand back as if the fabric of his suit had burned her. She didn't say a word. She just stared at him, her chest heaving. Leo stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a slow, deliberate movement. He didn't reach for the Glock holstered at the small of his back. Drawing a weapon in a crowded room with 2 shooters already primed was suicide. He needed a bottleneck. He needed chaos. He didn't walk toward the restrooms. He turned right, stepping smoothly into the narrow aisle that led past the waiter station and directly toward the kitchen. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man at table 12 flinch. The one with his hand in his coat started to stand. 3 seconds, Leo calculated. They have to navigate the tables. 4 seconds if the fat guy in the booth gets in their way. He rounded the oak partition of the waiter station. Maeve was standing there, leaning heavily against the counter, her eyes squeezed shut, clutching a tray of dirty silverware like a shield. Leo didn't slow down. He grabbed her by the bicep. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness. It was a vice, tight enough to bruise. Maeve gasped, her eyes flying open. She tried to yank her arm away, but it was like pulling against iron. "You wrote this," Leo stated. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what—" "Save it," Leo cut her off, his voice a low, harsh rasp. "You know the layout. Kitchen. Now." "I can't. I'm on the clock. In 5 seconds, those men are going to walk around this corner," Leo said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. There was no charm left, only a raw, desperate violence. "If they see you standing next to me, they will put a bullet in your chest just to clear the sightline. Move." He didn't give her a choice. He shoved her forward toward the swinging metal doors. The heavy, steel-clad doors of the kitchen swung inward with a loud thwack. The back of house was a different universe. The ambient jazz was replaced by the deafening roar of industrial exhaust fans, the rhythmic chopping of a prep cook's knife against a plastic board, and the aggressive hiss of garlic hitting hot oil. The air was a sauna of steam, grease and shouting in rapid-fire Spanish. Maeve stumbled as Leo pushed her through, her rubber-soled shoes catching on the sticky quarry tile. She caught her balance against a stainless steel prep counter, rattling a row of pristine white plates. "Hey, you can't be back here," shouted Chef Raoul, a massive man with a heavily tattooed forearm, pointing a pair of tongs at Leo. Leo ignored him. He kept his hand firmly on the small of Maeve's back, a physical anchor propelling her forward. His other hand finally moved to his back, sliding under the tailored jacket. When it emerged, he was holding a matte black Glock 19. The kitchen went dead silent. The chopping stopped. The shouting ceased. The only sound was the sizzling oil and the relentless hum of the refrigerators. "Which way is the alley exit?" Leo demanded. His voice didn't boom. It cut through the thick air like a razor. Maeve couldn't breathe. The smell of the raw meat on the counter to her left suddenly made her acutely nauseous. She looked at the gun, then up at Leo's face. He was sweating now. A bead traced the line of his jaw. His eyes were darting toward the swinging doors they had just come through. He wasn't a cool, collected action hero. He was an animal cornered in a cage, operating entirely on lethal instinct. "Maeve, look at me," Leo snapped. "Where is the door?" Back left. Past the walk-in freezer," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Walk, fast." He pushed her again. They moved down the narrow aisle between the blazing stoves and the plating stations. Line cooks pressed themselves flat against the walls, their hands raised, eyes wide with terror. Thwack! The kitchen doors swung open behind them. Maeve flinched, biting down on a scream. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The two men from table 12 stood in the doorway. The thick-necked one had a suppressed pistol drawn, the long black cylinder of the silencer making the weapon look grotesquely large. "Down!" Leo roared. He shoved Maeve hard. She hit the floor, her knees slamming into the hard tile. Pain shot up her legs, but the adrenaline masked the worst of it. She scrambled under a stainless steel prep table, her hands slick with a mixture of spilled olive oil and floor cleaner. Pfft, pfft. The suppressed gunshots sounded like heavy staple guns. Something shattered violently above Maeve's head. A ceramic plate exploded, showering her in sharp white shards and a spray of hot marinara sauce. It hit her cheek, burning the skin. Leo didn't dive for cover. He planted his feet, brought his weapon up in a two-handed grip, and fired. The sound of unsuppressed gunfire in the enclosed kitchen was apocalyptic. It was a concussive shockwave that punched Maeve in the eardrums, leaving behind a shrill, agonizing ringing. The thick-necked hitman stumbled backward, his shoulder blooming with a sudden, dark red stain. He crashed into a rack of hanging copper pots, bringing them down in a deafening clatter. His partner ducked behind the heavy oak doorframe, returning fire blindly. Bullets ripped through the kitchen. A heavy cast-iron pan clanged as a round struck it. A bag of flour exploded on a top shelf, sending a thick white cloud cascading down over the stoves, mixing with the steam to create a blinding fog. "Move!" Leo barked, grabbing Maeve by the collar of her apron and hauling her out from under the table. She was dead weight for a second, her legs refusing to cooperate, before sheer panic took the wheel. They ran through the flour dust. Maeve coughed, the fine powder coating her throat, tasting like chalk. They reached the heavy steel door at the back. It was painted a chipped industrial grey. A bright red panic bar spanned the width of it. Leo slammed his hip into the bar. The door shoved open, spilling them out into the damp, freezing night air of the alleyway. The contrast was staggering, from the blistering heat and blinding lights of the kitchen to the dim, claustrophobic darkness of the brick-lined alley. It smelled of rotting garbage, wet cardboard, and stale urine. Leo didn't stop. He dragged Maeve down the alley, their footsteps splashing through shallow puddles, reflecting the amber glow of a distant street lamp. "We have to get to the street," Leo breathed heavily, glancing behind them. The kitchen door was slowly swinging shut on its pneumatic hinge. "My purse," Maeve sobbed, a hysterical, entirely irrational thought bubbling to the surface. "My keys are in my purse in the locker." Leo stopped abruptly, pushing her back into the deep shadow of a rusted dumpster. He pressed himself against the brick wall beside her. He reached out, grabbing her face with his free hand. His fingers were cold, calloused, and trembling slightly. "Listen to me," he whispered, his face inches from hers. The smell of cordite clung to his clothes, sharp and metallic. "Your life as a waitress ended 10 minutes ago. You don't have a purse. You don't have an apartment. The men in there work for a syndicate that doesn't leave loose ends. If they saw your face, you are dead." Maeve stared at him, tears cutting tracks through the flour dust on her cheeks. Her chest heaved. The reality of the situation crashed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She hadn't just saved a man's life. She had tied herself to a sinking stone. "Why didn't you just leave?" she cried softly, her voice breaking. "Why did you drag me into this?" Leo looked away, his jaw tightening. For a fraction of a second, the cold Mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man looking at the wreckage of his own life. "Because," he rasped, "the woman I planned to marry just tried to put a bullet in my brain. I don't know who bought her. I don't know who to trust. But you—" He looked back at her, his dark eyes finding hers in the gloom. "You wrote the note. Right now, you are the only person in this city I know isn't trying to kill me." The kitchen door at the end of the alley slammed open. Heavy boots hit the pavement. Leo raised the Glock. "Stay behind me." The alleyway was a canyon of wet brick and rotting pallets. The single street lamp at the far end flickered, casting long, frantic shadows against the dumpsters. The kitchen door didn't just open. It was kicked so hard the hinges shrieked. The second hitman stepped into the pale light, his suppressed pistol leading the way. He didn't shout. He didn't spray bullets blindly. He moved with the terrifying, sweeping precision of a man who did this for a living. Leo didn't wait for the man to find them in the gloom. He shoved his arm around the rusted corner of the dumpster and fired twice. The Glock's unsuppressed roar in the narrow space was physically painful. It was a pressure wave that boxed Maeve's ears, leaving her completely deaf for 2 agonizing seconds. Concrete dusted down on her shoulders as the hitman returned fire, his bullets biting into the brickwork directly above Leo's head. "Stay low!" Leo yelled, though it sounded muted and far away to Maeve. He didn't fire again. He grabbed the collar of her shirt, missing the apron entirely, and hauled her up. They ran. It wasn't a sprint. It was a desperate, stumbling scramble over slippery garbage bags and broken glass. Maeve's rubber-soled work shoes, designed for slick kitchen floors, caught on the jagged edge of a discarded wooden crate. She went down hard, scraping her knee against the asphalt. The pain was sharp, a burning tear through her slacks. But the terror was louder. A bullet hit a metal trash can 3 feet to her left with a loud, hollow ping. Leo was there instantly, an uncompromising force hauling her to her feet by her bicep. He half carried, half dragged her towards the mouth of the alley. The air here tasted like damp earth and exhaust fumes. "My car," Leo gasped, his breath ragged. "Grey sedan, across the street." They burst out of the alley onto the damp pavement of the avenue. It was late, the traffic sparse. A fine mist had begun to fall, leaving greasy halos around the streetlights. Leo didn't look both ways. He dragged Maeve into the road. A taxi slammed on its brakes, the horn blaring, a long, angry sound that cut through the ringing in Maeve's ears. The grey sedan was parked illegally next to a fire hydrant. It was entirely unremarkable, a vehicle designed to be invisible. Leo didn't fumble with keys. He pressed his thumb to a hidden sensor under the driver's side door handle. The locks clacked open heavily. "Get in, floorboard," he ordered, throwing her towards the passenger side. Maeve scrambled inside, folding herself into the footwell. The carpet smelled of chemical pine and old dust. It pressed against her cheek. She clamped her hands over her head, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the glass to shatter. The driver's side door slammed. The engine didn't roar, it purred, a quiet, high-end hum entirely incongruous with the car's battered exterior. Tires spun on the wet asphalt, catching grip with a violent jerk that threw Maeve against the seat base. Leo didn't turn on the headlights. He ripped the steering wheel to the left, running a red light, taking a sharp corner that sent a loose, heavy object, a flashlight or a tool, skittering across the floorboard to hit Maeve's ankle. In the rearview mirror, bathed in the amber glow of the intersection, a dark SUV pulled out of the alley they had just abandoned. "Did they see us?" Maeve whispered, her voice vibrating against her knees. "Keep your head down," Leo said. His voice was no longer the sharp bark of a cornered animal in the kitchen. It had flattened out. It was dead, completely devoid of inflection. He drove with aggressive, terrifying precision. He didn't speed erratically. He weaved through the grid of the city, taking 3 right turns, a left, down a narrow service road behind a strip mall, and finally merging onto the westbound expressway. The rhythmic thump-thump of the highway expansion joints became a hypnotic drumbeat beneath them. After 20 minutes of suffocating silence, Leo reached over and pulled the passenger seat back. "You can sit up," he said quietly. Maeve unfolded herself. Her joints ached. The cut on her cheek from the shattered dinner plate throbbed in time with her pulse, the marinara sauce having dried into a sticky, painful crust. She kept her hands in her lap because they wouldn't stop trembling. She looked at Leo. The dashboard lights cast harsh, upward shadows on his face. He looked 10 years older than he had sitting at table 4. The tailored jacket was smeared with white flour and grey brick dust. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, but it was his eyes that terrified her most. They were fixed on the road, entirely blank, staring through the windshield into a void she couldn't see. He was bleeding. A slow, dark ribbon of blood leaked from a shallow graze along his left temple, slipping into the collar of his white shirt. He hadn't seemed to notice. "You're bleeding," Maeve said. Her voice was raspy, throat coated in flour dust. Leo reached up, touched the side of his head with 2 fingers, and looked at the blood. He wiped his fingers on his trousers. "It's a graze, brick shrapnel." "Where are we going?" "Somewhere they aren't." Maeve looked out the window. The city skyline was receding, a cluster of glowing needles fading into the low-hanging fog. The neon signs of cheap motels, auto body shops, and late-night diners smeared past the glass. "I have a cat," Maeve said suddenly. The words spilled out without her permission. "A ginger cat. He needs to be fed at 6 in the morning. He yells if he isn't fed." Leo didn't look at her. "He'll have to yell. You don't understand. My neighbor has a spare key, but she won't check until tomorrow night, and I have to—" "Maeve," Leo interrupted. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was suffocatingly heavy. "The men who came into that kitchen work for a man named Sullivan. Sullivan doesn't leave loose threads. By tomorrow morning, they will have the security footage from Il Refugio. They will have your name from the manager's office. They will visit your apartment. If your neighbor is there feeding your cat, they will kill her too, just to be safe. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Maeve stopped breathing. The damp cold of the air conditioning vent blew directly onto her face, but she felt entirely numb. The small, mundane realities of her life, the stack of unpaid electric bills on her counter, the squeaky left pedal on her bicycle, the smell of her favorite cheap coffee, were burning down to ash in her mind, leaving a terrifying, empty crater. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the passenger window and began to quietly, violently weep. Leo let her cry. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't have any to give. He just drove deeper into the dark. The motel was a relic from the 1970s. A squat, L-shaped cinder block building huddled beneath a buzzing, half-dead neon sign that read, "The Pine Sea Est." Leo parked the sedan around the back, wedging it between a rusted-out dumpster and a wall overgrown with damp ivy. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hiss of highway traffic and the rhythmic dripping of water from an AC unit above them. "Stay here," Leo said, pulling a damp clump of cash from his trouser pocket. Maeve didn't argue. She felt hollowed out. She watched him walk through the drizzle to the bulletproof glass of the night manager's window. He didn't look like a kingpin anymore. The ruined suit, the blood drying on his temple, the weary slump of his shoulders. He looked like a man who had lost a fight with a freight train. 5 minutes later, he returned, opening her door. "Room 14, keep your head down." Room 14 smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and the sharp, headache-inducing tang of industrial bleach. The carpet was a dark, unidentifiable color that felt sticky beneath Maeve's shoes. There were 2 double beds with thin, mustard-yellow bedspreads. A heavy CRT television sat chained to a particle board dresser. Leo locked the door. He engaged the deadbolt, threw the chain, and jammed a heavy wooden chair under the doorknob. Then he walked to the window, parting the heavy, dusty curtains just a fraction of an inch to check the parking lot before snapping them completely shut. Only then did he let out a breath. It shuddered on the way out. He took off his suit jacket, dropping it on the floor. His holster was strapped over his shoulders, the dark leather stark against his ruined white shirt. He pulled the Glock, ejected the magazine, caught the chambered round in the air, and placed the weapon on the nightstand. The metallic clicks sounded incredibly loud in the small room. Maeve stood awkwardly by the door, hugging her arms across her chest. The cold from the rain had seeped into her bones. "Bathroom is through there," Leo said, pointing without looking at her. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, furthest from the door. He put his elbows on his knees and buried his face in his hands. Maeve walked into the bathroom. The fluorescent light hummed angrily when she flicked the switch. The mirror above the sink was pitted with age. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat and rain. Her face was smeared with grey flour and soot. On her left cheekbone, a jagged cut from the shattered dinner plate wept a thin line of blood that mixed with the dried, dark red marinara sauce. She looked like a casualty of war. She turned on the tap. The water sputtered, coming out rust brown before clearing. She cupped her hands, bringing the freezing water to her face. It stung the cut, but the shock of the cold helped clear the thick fog in her brain. She scrubbed at her skin with a cheap, scratchy washcloth, watching the water in the sink turn pink and grey. When she finally emerged, clutching the damp washcloth, the room felt different. Leo hadn't moved. He was still sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the stained carpet between his boots. He looked entirely hollowed out. "You need to clean that," Maeve said softly, pointing the washcloth at his head. Leo blinked, slowly pulling himself back from wherever his mind had gone. He touched his temple. "It's fine. It's going to get infected," she countered, her voice gaining a fraction of its normal strength. Survival instinct was a strange thing. Now that the bullets had stopped flying, her brain desperately sought a practical task to latch onto. She walked over, holding out the washcloth. Leo looked at the cloth, then at her. He reached up, taking it from her fingers. Their hands brushed. His skin was freezing. He pressed the damp cloth to his temple, wincing slightly as the cheap soap bit into the raw flesh. "Why did she do it?" Maeve asked. The question hung in the stale air, heavy and intrusive. Leo lowered the cloth. He stared at the mustard-yellow wall. The muscle in his jaw feathered. "Chloe isn't a hardened criminal. She likes the money. She likes the access. But she hates the paranoia. She hates looking over her shoulder." He laughed, a short, ugly sound devoid of humor. Someone finally offered her a way out, a golden parachute. "Hand me over, keep the offshore accounts, walk away clean." "You really think she'd trade your life for a vacation?" Maeve asked, unable to mask her incredulity. Leo looked up at her, his dark eyes dead and flat. "In my world, Maeve, loyalty is just a lease, and someone outbid me." He tossed the bloody washcloth onto the dresser. The hit was clean, professional, Sullivan's men. But Sullivan wouldn't make a move on me directly unless he knew my internal security was compromised. Unless he knew exactly where I'd be, sitting with my back to a wall, relaxed. He stood up, pacing the short distance between the bed and the television. "She texted them from the table," he muttered, talking more to himself than to Maeve. "She gave them the green light when the appetizers were cleared? But who brokered the deal? Who introduced Chloe to Sullivan?" Maeve watched him pace. The terror was receding, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity she didn't know she possessed. She remembered standing by the waiter station, trying to mind her own business. She remembered the blue glow of the phone screen reflecting off the heavy linen tablecloth. "She wasn't texting," Maeve said quietly. Leo stopped pacing. He turned his head slowly. "What?" "When I poured the water," Maeve said, her brow furrowing as she reconstructed the memory. "I saw her screen, just for a second. The background was black. The text bubbles were grey. It wasn't iMessage. It wasn't WhatsApp." Leo's eyes narrowed. "Signal? Wicker?" "I don't know the apps," Maeve said, crossing her arms again. "But I saw the contact name at the top of the screen. It was big, white font. Not a name, just numbers." Leo stepped toward her, the predator returning to his posture. "What numbers?" Maeve closed her eyes, visualizing the blue glow, the manicured thumb swiping across the glass. It was an area code, 020, international. Leo exhaled sharply, a hiss of realization through his teeth. "London." He turned away, raking both hands through his hair. The pieces were clicking into place, and the picture they formed was catastrophic. "Sullivan didn't buy her," Leo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "Sullivan is just the local muscle. The broker is in London, which means this isn't a turf war." He looked back at Maeve, the gravity of the situation settling over the room like a physical weight. "This is a hostile takeover of the entire Eastern Seaboard network, and they started from the inside out." The revelation sucked the remaining air out of the suffocating motel room. Leo walked to the particle board dresser. He dug into the inside pocket of his discarded suit jacket, pulling out a small, thick black phone. It wasn't a smartphone. It was a rugged, encrypted brick designed to do one thing securely. He powered it on. The screen glowed a sickly green, illuminating the harsh angles of his face. Maeve watched from the edge of the second bed. Her legs had finally given out. and she sat perched on the mattress, her fingers picking anxiously at a loose thread on the mustard-yellow blanket. The surreal nature of the night was settling in. Hours ago, she was worrying about an uneven table wobbling under a customer's soup bowl. Now, she was locked in a motel room with a wounded crime boss, deciphering assassination plots. "Who are you calling?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A ghost," Leo replied without looking up. His thumb moved rapidly over the tactile keypad. "My network is dead. If Chloe sold me out, she gave them the roster. My captains, my lieutenants, they're either bought or they're currently bleeding out in their driveways. I can't trust anyone I pay." "Then who?" Lasso held up a hand, demanding silence. He brought the thick phone to his ear. The room was quiet enough that Maeve could hear the digital ringing. It clicked over. No greeting, just the hollow, static hiss of an open line. "It's me," Leo said. A mechanical, artificially distorted voice crackled through the tiny speaker. "You are supposed to be dead. The wire transfers from your domestic accounts began clearing 30 minutes ago. Chloe has the passcodes," Leo said, his jaw tightening. "Freeze the offshore routing, everything in the Caymans, everything in Zurich. Lock it behind the biometric failsafe." "Already done. But the domestic cache is gone. Swept clean. Who am I burning?" "Sullivan pulled the trigger," Leo said, his eyes tracking the flickering neon light slipping through the curtain gap. "But he's subcontracting. The broker is operating out of London, an 020 number." The line went silent for a long, heavy moment. Only the static remained. "London?" the distorted voice finally replied. The mechanical tone couldn't hide the shift in gravity. "If London is sanctioning this, you are not fighting a rival family, Leo. You are fighting the board of directors. You are excommunicado." "I need a name," Leo demanded, his grip on the phone tightening until his knuckles popped. "Who is the 020 number? Who is handling Chloe? Give me 20 minutes to ping the cellular towers near the restaurant. If she was active on an encrypted line during the hit, I can isolate the handshake. Stay off the grid." The line went dead. Leo slowly lowered the phone, placing it next to the Glock on the nightstand. He sat back down on the bed, leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked thoroughly, profoundly exhausted. The adrenaline crash was hitting him hard, pulling the color from his skin, leaving him grey and gaunt. "Who was that?" Maeve asked carefully. "My accountant," Leo muttered. "Or the closest thing I have to one. He lives in a server farm somewhere in Eastern Europe." He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. "He's right. If the London syndicate backed this, I have no allies. I have no money on this continent. I am a walking ghost." He looked at Maeve. Really looked at her. She was sitting on the terrible motel bed, her uniform stained with food, dirt, and his blood. She looked small, frightened, and entirely out of place. "You should have let me eat the bullet, Maeve," he said softly. There was no menace in his voice now, only a quiet, brutal honesty. "You slipped me that note because you thought I could protect you from the fallout. But I can't. I don't even have a car that isn't flagged by now. Tomorrow, they will put a bounty on my head so large that every street gang and crooked cop in the tri-state area will be hunting me." Maeve stopped picking at the thread. She looked down at her hands. The bleach from the washcloth had dried out her skin, making the knuckles look red and raw. "I didn't slip you the note because I wanted protection," she said. Her voice was steady now. The tremor was gone, replaced by the flat, cold resignation of someone who had hit rock bottom and found a solid floor. Leo frowned slightly. "Then why?" Maeve looked up, meeting his dark, ruined eyes. "Because I've spent the last 6 years of my life watching people with money treat the rest of us like furniture. I watch them cheat on their wives, scream at kitchen staff, and wipe their mouths with napkins that cost more than I make in a week. Chloe looked right through me every time she sat at that table. She swallowed hard, the memory of the blonde woman's cold, dismissive eyes flashing in her mind. She sat there, drinking a $200 glass of wine, waiting for you to get your brains blown out so she could go on vacation, Maeve said, her tone laced with a sudden quiet venom. I didn't do it to save you. I did it because I was sick of watching people like her win. Leo stared at her. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and profound. For the first time all night, the dead, hollow look in his eyes cracked. A tiny, dangerous spark ignited in the dark. It wasn't amusement, and it wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. He slowly reached for his holster, unbuckling the leather strap. Well, Leo said softly, a dark, cynical edge bleeding back into his voice. If we're going to make sure she loses, we're going to need a better car. On the nightstand, the encrypted phone lit up with a brilliant, sickly green flash. The screen displayed a single, decrypted name. Leo picked it up. He read the screen, and the spark in his eyes turned into a wildfire. Get your shoes on, Maeve, he said, chambering around into the Glock. We're going to pay a visit to Sullivan's accountant. The rain turned from a mist into a freezing, unrelenting downpour by the time they reached the affluent suburbs of Westchester. Lesso had hot-wired a 2011 Ford Econoline van from the motel parking lot. It smelled aggressively of wet dog and stale French fries, but it blended into the dark roads perfectly. Arthur Hayes lived in a gated cul-de-sac. His house was a massive, modern monstrosity of glass and steel, completely devoid of character. The kind of house bought with blood money, laundered through corporate real estate. Leo parked 2 blocks away, cutting the headlights. He leaned against the steering wheel, his breathing shallow. The graze on his temple had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was swollen and bruised a sickly purple. Arthur is a paranoid man, Leo said, his voice a low rasp. He has cameras, motion sensors. If a man my size walks up that driveway, he hits the panic button and the local police are here in 4 minutes. Maeve stared through the water-streaked windshield. So how do we get in? Leo turned to look at her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her stained apron, which she still wore over her slacks, and the exhaustion etched into her face. No, Maeve said, her stomach tightening. Absolutely not. You know how to carry yourself, Maeve. I watched you for 2 years. You know how to be invisible. I serve sea-base, Leo. I don't breach secure compounds. You're not breaching. You're delivering. Leo reached into the back of the van and grabbed a crumpled brown paper bag left behind by the previous owner. He rolled the top down. Arthur works late. He orders out. He treats delivery drivers like stray dogs. If he sees a tired woman holding a bag in the rain, his ego will override his paranoia. He'll open the door to tell you to go to the service entrance. That's all I need. Maeve looked at the greasy brown bag. Her hands started to shake again. It wasn't the frantic, vibrating terror from the restaurant. It was a cold, heavy dread. But underneath it, the spite she had found in the motel room flared. Chloe had treated her like a stray dog, too. If I die on this porch, Maeve whispered, taking the bag, I am going to haunt you. Fair enough, Leo said. He checked the chamber of his Glock. I'll be right behind you. The walk up the driveway felt like a march to the gallows. The rain soaked through her thin uniform shirt instantly, plastering it to her skin. The cold was a physical weight. She kept her eyes down, her shoulders slumped. She didn't have to act tired. She was deeply, bone-achingly exhausted. She reached the massive oak front door and pressed the intercom button. A sharp, staticky voice crackled. "Who is it?" "Delivery for Hayes," Maeve mumbled, leaning into the character. She shifted her weight, sighing audibly. "Look, my GPS took me to 3 wrong houses. Can you just take this so I can go home?" Silence. The camera above the door whirred, its red lens adjusting in the dark. "I didn't order anything," Arthur's voice snapped. "Ticket says Hayes, 42 Oak Creek, paid through the app. If you don't want it, I'm leaving it on the wet mat and marking it delivered." She turned her back to the camera, feigning exasperation. A deadbolt clicked. The heavy door swung open inward just a few inches. A man with thinning grey hair, wearing a plush silk bathrobe and gold wire-rimmed glasses, peered out. "Listen here, you stupid." A shadow detached itself from the manicured hedge to Maeve's left. Leo hit the door with his shoulder, a brutal kinetic impact that sent Arthur flying backward onto the polished marble floor of the foyer. Maeve dropped the bag, stepping inside before the door could close. Leo didn't waste time. He kicked the door shut, pinning Arthur to the marble with a knee to the chest. He pressed the cold steel of the Glock directly against the bridge of the accountant's nose. Arthur's eyes bulged, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Leo," he choked out. "Leo, please." "Where is she, Arthur?" Leo's voice was dead calm. It was the voice of a man who had already decided whether he was going to pull the trigger. "Where is the transfer happening?" "I don't know what." Leo pressed the barrel harder, breaking the skin. A thin line of blood ran down Arthur's nose. "Chloe has the codes, but she needs a secure terminal to route the Cayman funds to the London broker. She wouldn't use her phone for that." "Where is she?" "Teterboro," Arthur screamed, his hands hovering frantically near his face. "Teterboro Airport, Private Hangar 4. She's flying out tonight, meeting the London proxy in Halifax to finalize the sweep." Leo didn't move the gun. "Who holds the ledger, Arthur? Her or the proxy?" "She has the physical drive," Arthur sobbed, tears mixing with the blood on his face. "The biometric lock, she has it in her purse." "Leo, I swear I didn't know until an hour ago. Sullivan forced my hand." Leo stared down at him. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. "You always were a coward, Arthur." "Tie him up," he said, looking back at Maeve. Maeve blinked. "With what?" Leo gestured with his chin to the silk sash of Arthur's bathrobe. "Get creative." The smell of aviation fuel was thick and suffocating, masking the damp rot of the nearby marshlands. Teterboro Airport at 3 a.m. was a ghost town of private jets and empty tarmac, illuminated by harsh halogen floodlights. Hangar 4 was set apart from the main strip. A sleek, matte-black Gulfstream idled on the concrete, its engines emitting a high-pitched, bone-rattling whine. Leo and Maeve crouched behind a stack of blue plastic shipping crates near the perimeter fence. Leo was worse now. The adrenaline was burning away, leaving a sluggish, heavy exhaustion in its wake. He leaned heavily against the plastic, his breathing wet and ragged. "There," Leo pointed. Through the glass walls of the private terminal lounge, Maeve saw her. Chloe was sitting on a white leather sofa. She looked immaculate. She had changed into a tailored charcoal trench coat, her ash-blonde hair perfectly smooth. She was sipping from a porcelain cup, checking her watch. Beside her, on the glass coffee table, sat a small metallic rectangle, the ledger drive. 2 men stood by the lounge doors, Sullivan's men. They wore tactical vests over their suits and carried compact submachine guns slung low across their chests. "We can't take them," Maeve whispered, panic rising in her throat. "Leo, there's 2 of them with automatic weapons. You can barely stand." "I don't have to take them both," Leo rasped. He pulled his spare magazine, checking the rounds. I just have to create a vacuum. He looked at Maeve. The rain had washed the flour and blood from her face, leaving her pale and shivering in the dark. There's a fire alarm pull station on the side of the building, Leo said, pointing to a red box bolted to the corrugated metal wall 50 yards away. When I start shooting, they are going to push forward. They won't flank because they don't know my numbers. You pull that alarm. The halon suppression system in the hangar will trigger. It drops the visibility to 0 and kills the noise. And then what? She asked, her voice cracking. Then I take the drive, and we walk away. Maeve looked at the red box. It felt miles away. But looking back at the lounge, seeing Chloe sitting there so casually, checking her watch while Leo bled out in the rain, it sparked that quiet, venomous anger again. "Give me 30 seconds, Maeve said. She didn't wait for him to argue. She slipped away from the crates, hugging the shadows of the perimeter fence. The asphalt was slick, her rubber shoes slipping slightly with every step. She kept her eyes on the 2 guards inside the glass. They were looking at the jet, bored. She reached the wall. She pressed her back against the cold, wet metal, inching toward the red box. 20 feet, 10 feet, crack, crack. The gunshots shattered the night, incredibly loud against the flat expanse of the runway. Inside the lounge, the glass wall instantly spiderwebbed as Leo's rounds hit. One of the guards went down hard, clutching his thigh. The other barked an order into his radio, raising his weapon and laying down a deafening spray of suppressing fire toward the blue crates. Chloe shrieked, dropping her cup, scrambling backward over the white leather sofa. Maeve lunged. She hit the red alarm box, grabbing the white handle and yanking it down with all her body weight. Klaxons instantly began to wail, a shrill, rhythmic screech that vibrated in Maeve's teeth. Overhead, the hangar's massive emergency vents blew open. With a concussive hiss, thick, milky white halon gas poured from the ceiling, flooding the lounge and the tarmac in a matter of seconds. It was like walking into a cloud of dry ice. Maeve couldn't see her own hands. The gunfire stopped, replaced by the chaotic shouting of the remaining guard and the mechanical scream of the alarm. Through the thick white fog, a shadow moved. Maeve stumbled forward, coughing as the chemical gas coated her throat. She pushed through the shattered glass of the lounge doors. "Leo!" she coughed out. The fog shifted. 2 figures were locked together near the coffee table. Leo had the guard pinned against the wall, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. The guard was thrashing, his hands clawing at Leo's face, trying to bring his weapon up. Leo was losing. His injured side gave way, his knee buckling onto the carpet. Maeve didn't think. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, the heavy glass carafe of coffee Chloe had been drinking from. She stepped forward and brought it down with a sickening, wet crunch against the back of the guard's head. The glass shattered. Hot, dark coffee exploded outward. The guard went limp, sliding down the wall like a puppet with cut strings. Leo fell back, gasping for air, clutching his ribs. He looked up at Maeve, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something resembling awe. "Leo!" The voice cut through the fog. Chloe. She emerged from the white smoke, holding a small, silver pistol. Her hands were shaking violently. The immaculate facade was gone. Her mascara had run, tracking dark lines down her pale cheeks. "Don't move!" Chloe screamed, pointing the gun at Leo's chest. Leo slowly climbed to his feet. He didn't raise his weapon. He just looked at her. "You don't know how to shoot that, Chloe. The safety is still engaged." Chloe looked down at the gun in panic. It was a bluff, but it gave Leo the second he needed. He kicked the glass coffee table hard. It slid across the carpet, slamming into Chloe's shins. She stumbled, crying out in pain, dropping the gun. Leo stepped forward. He didn't hit her. He simply reached down and picked up the metallic ledger drive from the floor where it had fallen. Chloe scrambled back against the white leather sofa, her chest heaving. "They'll kill you, Leo. London won't stop. They'll hunt you forever." "Let them," Leo said softly. He slipped the drive into his pocket. "You're the one who promised them my money, Chloe. Without this drive, you have nothing to trade. When the proxy in Halifax realizes you lost the ledger, they aren't going to offer you a golden parachute. They're going to tie you to an anchor." Chloe's eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror as the reality of her situation hit her. The money was gone. The protection was gone. She was trapped in the crosshairs she had drawn herself. "Leo, please," she begged, the viciousness evaporating into pathetic, desperate tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Leo looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The love he had felt for her was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. "I'm not," he said. He turned his back on her. He looked at Maeve, who was standing in the swirling white fog, her chest heaving. The broken handle of the coffee carafe still clutched in her bleeding hand. "Let's go," Leo said. They walked out through the shattered glass, leaving Chloe alone in the fog, sobbing into the silence of the wailing alarms. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the grey, overcast sky in bruised shades of purple and dull orange. They were sitting in a vinyl booth at a dilapidated diner somewhere off Route 9 in New Jersey. The neon sign outside buzzed rhythmically. The place smelled of old grease, burnt toast, and cheap black coffee. Leo sat across from Maeve. He looked terrible. His face was a patchwork of bruises, his white shirt completely ruined by blood, dirt, and coffee stains. He had bought a cheap, grey zip-up hoodie from a gas station down the road, and it hung loosely over his shoulders. Maeve wasn't much better. She still wore her slacks, but she had thrown away the bistro apron. Her hands were wrapped in cheap paper napkins to stop the bleeding from the broken carafe. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with a deeply lined face, poured 2 cups of black coffee without asking, slid the pot onto the table, and walked away without looking twice at their battered state. People who ate at this diner at 5 a.m. didn't ask questions. Maeve wrapped both hands around the thick ceramic mug. The heat seeped into her skin, agonizing and wonderful. She took a sip. It tasted like battery acid and burnt copper. It was the best thing she had ever drank. "What happens now?" Maeve asked quietly. Her voice was scratchy, raw from the halon gas. Leo took the metallic ledger drive out of his pocket and set it on the sticky Formica table. It caught the dim fluorescent light. "There's $40 million on that drive," Leo said, his voice a low, exhausted rumble. "Clean money. Untraceable." Maeve stared at it. It looked entirely unremarkable, a piece of metal the size of a matchbox. She thought about her overdue electric bill. She thought about her ginger cat yelling for breakfast. "Can you access it?" she asked. Leo nodded slowly. "My biometric lock. I can route it to a dozen different shell accounts by noon. But the moment I do, London will see the ripple. They'll know I'm alive. The hunt starts." He picked up his coffee mug but didn't drink. He just stared into the black liquid. "I can't go back to the restaurant, can I?" Maeve asked. It wasn't a question, really. It was an acknowledgement of the ash behind her. "No," Leo said, looking up at her. His dark eyes were softer now, stripped of the paranoia and the armor. "Sullivan's men saw your face. You hit one of them with a coffee pot. If you go back to your apartment, you're dead." Maeve absorbed this. A day ago, the thought of losing her meager, stressful life would have sent her into a panic attack. Now she felt a strange, terrifying sense of liberation. The slate wasn't just wiped clean, it was shattered. "I always hated that apartment anyway," she muttered, a dark, cynical smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Leo let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. It was a dry, rusty sound. "I have a contact in Montreal," he said quietly. "A forger. He can get us new papers, passports, social security numbers, clean slates." "Us?" Maeve raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me a cut of the ghost money? You saved my life twice tonight, Maeve, once with a pen, once with a coffee carafe." Leo pushed the ledger drive toward the center of the table. "I owe you. Half the drive is yours. You can take it, go to Europe, disappear. You'll never have to pour a glass of water for someone like Chloe again." Maeve looked at the drive. $20 million. A new name, a new life. She looked back up at Leo. He was a criminal. He was dangerous, cynical, and deeply broken. But sitting across from him in this greasy diner, surrounded by the smell of burnt toast and old mistakes, she realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. "I don't speak French," Maeve said, leaning back against the cracked vinyl booth. Leo's bruised mouth twitched into a genuine, tired smile. "Montreal is very accommodating. You'll learn." Maeve took another sip of the terrible coffee. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the table. They were both ghosts now, sitting in the ashes of their former lives. But as she watched Leo carefully pick up the ledger drive, she felt the first faint ember of something new. They didn't have an empire, but they had a car, a drive full of stolen money, and a head start. "All right," Maeve breathed, setting her mug down. "Let's go feed my cat." The sun rises on a new reality for Leo and Maeve. They survived the night, but the war with the London syndicate is just beginning. With $40 million and targets on their backs, where do two ghosts go to disappear? The empire has fallen, but the real hustle starts now. If you loved this dark, gritty ride, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter of this explosive story. The fallout is coming.